excited to share with you about this research. I've been working with Notre Dame since my master's program, and so in this doctoral program, I've been really excited to find my passion. I've been focusing on early childhood literacy for about 5 years, and some opportunities kept coming up that helped me narrow my interest into this dissertation topic. It all started with learning about the National Reading Panel's 5 components of reading during my undergrad years. I was immediately hooked. Something about that tangible and organized piece, it just became my new mantra. So phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, comprehension. It was just something that I could continue to share and grow with. So I had 10 years in the classroom where I was able to learn more about teaching children to read. I became passionate about that. I started to pick up patterns of behavior and trends for students who were learning to read and noticing those who were starting to struggle and some key components that they shared. I gained some awareness of phonemic awareness and the learning process, and I started to better understand those students who struggled compared to their grade level peers who did not. So in conjunction with that classroom experience, I started to build some courses in early literacy. I had some that focused on oral language and some that focused on reading. And I was, again, just drawn towards this literacy component. So when an opportunity came up at St. Mary's County Public Schools to work with them on a new initiative, they were launching an early intervention program in 2020. So I joined them. And this group of teachers, we identify and address the needs of the students in early literacy in K through 5. So we, in the county, will use DIBELS, the Dynamic Indicator of Basic Early Literacy Skills. And this is just a screening that helps to determine the fluency of students' reading skills and predict risk in future reading difficulties. If a student's DIBELS scores indicate some risk, then we'll use further diagnostic assessments. And so from all of that data, what we've done is we've started to send out teachers into schools to do intervention work, and just for a few hours a day. And so I'm able to be one of those intervention teachers. So as part of this system-wide approach, it evolved this literacy intervention where assistants would go to the neediest of schools and provide more opportunities for intervention services. Currently, the intervention support is provided in 11 of the county's 19 elementary schools. This is my 3rd year now working with the program. And I was inspired because this data set was just growing and growing. And I was like, ooh, you know, this is useful data. So we should be using it, not just reporting it. And so I was able to take a look at what we might do with that data. So I think it's important to note that reading is not just an innate ability, right? So reading, unlike walking or talking, which you can pick up from experiences in your environment, reading requires explicit and systematic instruction that builds from the smallest units of speech, which are phonemes. So in English, there's 44 phonemes, and these units of speech are the beginning stage of reading progression. They're aimed at an ultimate goal where students will tip from learning to read into reading to learn. The Education Commission of the United States released guidance for our school systems that identifies the shift happens most commonly after 3rd grade, and those students who are unable to acquire reading skills by 3rd grade are more likely to drop out before graduating high school. So current data from the NAEP assessments, which is countrywide, shows that 50% of our United States students are falling below basic level of proficiency in reading. And because of that, some states have adopted policies for 3rd grade retention based off of these reading proficiency assessments. That's pretty alarming. So 17 states, in fact, require retention in 3rd grade based off of that reading assessment, such as Ohio and Arizona. And so the Annie Casey Foundation, along with Hernandez, one of the researchers, they followed 4,000 students to determine the impact of these below basic reading proficiency scores in the 3rd grade. And they found that students are 4 times more likely to drop out. And sometimes you'll even see that as 6 times more likely, just depending on where they're falling in that reading score. If they're at the lowest, the most vulnerable kiddos, they're 6 times more likely to drop out before graduating. And so that trend is having dramatic effect on our students. So using quantitative methods, my study is going to aim at adding to this research on literacy interventions by measuring how the duration necessary to reach phonemic awareness proficiency varies between kindergarten and the grade 1 students. So the meaningful work that I'm looking to find is looking at interventions to better understand the component of duration and grade level. There's a lot of research that talks about interventions and the identification of students, progress monitoring along the intervention, the students who are adequately responding or inadequately responding, the different targets you might use for intervention, like phonemic awareness versus a phonics intervention, the format, and then components of fidelity, like who is teaching the intervention. Now, they're all worthy topics, but I'm choosing to research grade level and duration to better understand how a phonemic awareness intervention during kindergarten and first grade can impact their overall reading ability, shown through progress monitoring and these DIBELS assessments that our county is providing. My research questions look at grade level progress made from students who fall in the intensive needs category and bumping them into that strategic needs category based off of their DIBELS components. My research aims to identify grade level effects on the duration of support in order to reach that phonemic awareness proficiency. So I mentioned before that the National Reading Panel is credited for those 5 essential components that we all love, right? Phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension. And so the theoretical framework that I decided to use here as the backbone of my study is this developmental phase theory by Lene Erie. So her theory, it demonstrates how these essential components of reading, those 5, are a fluid progression of stages that shape the reader's development. And so a developmental stage theory divides development into distinct stages, and they're characterized by qualitative differences in behavior. So she describes 5 phases that are an essential part of the journey of learning to read. So the first one is pre-alphabetic. This is when children, they don't understand the nature of letter sound relationships yet. They might see the letter M for McDonald's, those golden arches, and they'll say McDonald's. And so they're just understanding that symbols have meaning. Then they move into the partial alphabetic phase when they start to realize that some of them have a very specific meaning, and that meaning can be used in different ways. And so this is when they start to grasp a few of those letter sound correspondences, but they're not yet able to like systematically decode or sound out the words. Then they'll move into their full alphabetic phase. This is when students know all the relationships between their letters and their sounds, and they start to use them to decode. It'll start off slowly, but it'll become better with practice. As they continue to practice, they get to the consolidated phase. This is when they're able to sound out each sound in a word individually and find patterns and analogies between words that makes it a little bit more fluent. And then they get to the automatic phase, and that's when they really are fluent readers. And so this developmental theory helped guide, okay, so where does this phonemic awareness piece fall and its essential component for building this reading? So in the literature review, there's a ton of research on early literacy intervention. Kindergarten, first grade, those are definitely a high time for phonemic awareness. And so that intervention has been happening for a long time in that age range. So I've highlighted just a few things that really helped me to identify how I was going to set up my design and my method for my study. For example, Lonigan and Shanahan, that was the report of the National Early Literacy Panel, and they were pulling information from a study by West and his colleagues in 2000. They were collecting data from a nationally representative sample of over 19,000 students. And this was during the 1998-1999 school year. So the researchers were collecting data on the participants' general knowledge and literacy and quantitative skills. But for the components of basic literacy, the study was assessing print familiarity, letter recognition, beginning and ending sounds, and that's phonemic awareness, rhyming words, and word recognition. And so in that sample, they found that 29% of the participants had mastered phonemic awareness skills by the end of that kindergarten year. And so 29%, that's pretty low, right? We already heard that 50% is our statistic nationwide of those who are below that basic level in the third grade. And so what they found following these students longitudinally is that this ability to use phonemic awareness at that first grade level was impacting their later reading outcomes compared to their grade level peers. And so what we're seeing is that we can test them very early on in order to understand that phonemic awareness is playing a key role later on. So phonemic awareness is important, definitely wanted to study that. Then as far as building this intervention, I wanted to make sure that it was a small group intervention because the studies are unanimous in deciding like that's really important to intervention work. So for example, Kavanaugh with his analysis of many literacy interventions found that 5 individual and 16 small group and 6 whole class interventions were synthesized, and he found those largest effects are in that small group format. And so that's also been found by other researchers as well. So the groups that we're working with in St. Mary's County, our groups won't go over 4 participants in a group. So it could be 2, could be 3, could be 4. And then another key component that helped me in developing my methods for this intervention is that systematic explicit instruction is important for intervention. And so Blessies and the colleagues, they found this had significant impact on reading gains for those at-risk kindergarten students. This was a study where they ran thousands of kindergarten students through these interventions and compared them to a control group where they were just business as usual. And they found significant difference for those students who had an intervention that had very clear components of how they were going to move through learning phonemic awareness. All right, so the purpose of this study, so we're using Dibble scores. This shows the different cutoffs. And so who are we trying to help with this research? We're trying to help the students who fall in Dibble's category of intensive support. And so that's that lowest bar, that red block there. So if students are falling in that red intensive support, they're going to qualify to seek intervention support using our system that we've developed by going into pushing into schools. And the goal of the intervention is that after they've finished their phonemic awareness, it would boost this overall composite score for students to be moving up into strategic support, because this composite score is not just about phonemic awareness. The research, as I've talked about, shows that phonemic awareness has an impact on the broader scale of reading development. And so this is an assigned value to their broader reading development. And so if we're able to support them in phonemic awareness, we want the larger goal obtained too, right? We want them to be better readers. And so my study is going to use duration as a dependent variable, identified by the number of sessions that the student would need to attend in order to reach proficiency in phonemic awareness. Progress monitoring data would be collected every 3 weeks. This is all going to be archival data. And 6 independent variables will categorize demographic information for participants. So significant differences may be found using a regression analysis. So we have our grade level variable, we have students that have different ethnicities, they're English learners, students with disabilities. All of these categories will be looked at in order to see any differences that we may be able to mark. So I'm using archival data from the year 2021 to 2022. Other researchers have used archival data to investigate early literacy intervention. The National Reading Panel, as well as Lene Erie, both used archival data in order to draw their conclusions on phonemic awareness interventions. Kavanaugh and his colleagues also looked at 20 years of kindergarten literacy interventions and found that certain features produce the largest effects, namely phonemic awareness, as well as their group size being small and an intensity of 15 to 30 minutes in each session. And so my proposed research will use all of those features. It will be a phonemic awareness intervention, it'll be a small group size, and that intensity, we use 20 minutes, and so that falls in the 15 to 30 minute window. I was involved in collecting this data. I was one of the 10 interventionists who went out into schools And in order to avoid potential bias effects, I'm not just using my data. And so I'm using the team of 10 interventionists that went out that year into 10 different schools in order to compile a large data set. And so actually it turns out to be 354 participants that I'll be able to use. That's 182 first graders and 172 kindergartners. Other studies have used similar number of participants and also found significant results. Like Burns and colleagues, they found a high correlation of phoneme isolation with blending and segmenting and letter sound knowledge in 192 kindergarten participants. Allure and her colleagues found a significant effect of reading intervention on first grade student phonemic awareness and nonsense word reading ability using 86 participants the first year and 167 participants the second year. So that helps to guide the number of participants that we would be using. The students in my data set are confidential. We use numerical identifiers. They're not known to myself, but the head of the literacy intervention at central office, she has the ability to identify the participants using this numerical identifier. And so when I have any questions regarding the data entries, like, for example, if an entry shows that a Dibble score is in the 2000s, that could cause disruption to my data analysis because the score shouldn't exceed 500. It would be possible to request a review of the data using Performance Matters software that the county has that holds all of these scores. And so she can look up our participant and clarify where the score should be. My regression analysis will look at two different Y variables. So we'll have the end of year composite score using the Dibbles data, and it'll determine if any of the independent variables had a significant effect on the student's total reading readiness at the end of the year following that intervention. And then the second Y variable is the number of sessions that will determine if any of the independent variables had a significant effect on how long the students remained in the intervention. So the reliability of this intervention is investigated by looking at the composite Dibbles end of year score. So the gains in phonemic awareness should push positive gains in other areas of reading, as I mentioned, leading into a jump in overall reading skills. So we want to know, like, did the intervention do what it was supposed to do, right? And then take a look at what categories of students might have had a greater effect size. Researchers like Lene Erie and Burns and his colleagues have shown the impact of phonemic awareness on these other reading areas. The impact of these results might be used to further understanding in phonemic awareness interventions. That would be like our overall goal. So how can we use these interventions more specifically in our schools? How can we get the most out of it? Of course, we know that the teacher is always the most expensive variable in teaching children learning to read. And so it's important for us to be using our resources wisely. And so the data that we find from this analysis will help us to determine how long the students will need intervention, what's the best time to be giving them this intervention, is it kindergarten, is it first grade? And so we will be able to use all of this and share it with teachers and other faculty members that may be able to support this, because our overall goal would not just to be having our interventionists going and pushing into schools, but to be training paraeducators in these kindergarten classrooms to be running the interventions themselves. And that could give us an extra interventionist in all of our schools for each kindergarten classroom, which would be so powerful. And so we need to understand a little bit more about this intervention and these variables that are impacting their reading success. And that way we can just help these at-risk learners.